There is a war the world explains and a war the world refuses to name. Iran and Israel are told to be enemies of politics, ideology, and power. But those explanations are recent, and they are shallow. This hatred did not begin with borders missiles or modern revolutions. It began long before Iran was called Iran, long before Israel returned to the land, long before Islam, before Christianity, before empires learned how to rise and fall. Scripture records something older, a tension written into bloodlines, a struggle assigned to territories, a conflict not born on earth, but reflected on it. What if Iran's hostility toward Israel is not learned, but inherited? What if it is not merely national, but spiritual? Tonight, we are not here to choose sides. We are here to trace origins back to the moment history and the unseen realm collided. And it begins with a people most never expect. Before the word Iran ever existed, this land carried another name, Elam. Elam was not Aryan. Elam was Semitic. According to the book of Genesis, Elam was a son of Shem, born from the same ancestral line as the Hebrews themselves. This means the soil that would one day become Iran was once inhabited by a people spiritually and ethnically closer to Israel than most modern histories are willing to admit. Iran's land did not begin as a stranger to the biblical world. It began as part of it. Elam appears early in Scripture not as an enemy, but as a neighboring civilization, ancient established, watching the same skies, shaped by the same post-flood world. For centuries, this region stood at the crossroads of Mesopotamia, absorbing ideas, gods, languages, and bloodlines. Then something changed. From the northern horizons came slow-moving migrations. Indo-European tribes later remembered as the Aryans. They did not arrive as a single invasion, but as generations of movement, settlement, and intermarriage. They did not erase Elam. They absorbed it. Cultures fused, bloodlines intertwined, memories layered upon memories. Out of this convergence emerged new peoples, the Medes and the Persians. And Scripture names their origin, Madai, a son of Japheth. This detail is not incidental. In the biblical tables of nations, Japheth's descendants are assigned vast territories stretching toward the north and east. Madai becomes the ancestral marker for the Median and Persian peoples, the backbone of what the world would later call Iran. Iran is not a biblical outsider. It stands inside the architecture of Genesis, inside the genealogy of nations, inside the unfolding map of divine history, not cursed, not forgotten, not excluded from Israel's story. For a time, these lineages coexisted, Shemite memory rooted in the land, Japhethite expansion shaping its future. Two destinies occupying the same geography, layered one upon the other. Because Scripture does not present history as random movement, but as purposeful placement. When bloodlines overlap and territories converge, the Bible suggests more than coincidence, it suggests assignment. Something subtle began to shift. Not in armies, not in borders, but in identity. The land remained the same, but the spiritual inheritance grew divided. The question was no longer who lived there, but which destiny would ultimately claim it. And that unresolved tension, buried deep beneath centuries of empire and conquest, would not remain silent forever. Because in the next part, Persia does not merely enter history, it steps directly into the destiny of Israel, and everything changes. Persia rises not as a footnote in history, but as a turning point. The land we now call Iran was known to the ancient world by another name. Persia, drawn from Parsa, the heartland of its power. To the Greeks, it was an empire of fire and gold. To Scripture, it was something far more unsettling. Persia was not Israel's enemy. It was Israel's rescuer. Jerusalem had fallen. The temple lay in ruins. The people of Israel sat in exile beneath foreign skies, their songs turned into laments. Babylon had crushed them not only politically, but spiritually, mocking their God, scattering their identity. Then, without warning, Babylon fell in a single night. Its conqueror was not an Israelite king, not a prophet, not a priest. It was Cyrus of Persia, a pagan ruler, a worshipper of foreign gods, yet named astonishingly by the God of Israel himself. My anointed. The word is deliberate, the same word used for kings of Israel, for priests, for those chosen for divine purpose. God did not merely use Cyrus, he claimed him. Cyrus shattered Babylon's gates, released the Jewish captives, and did what no conqueror in history had done before he sent a defeated people home. More than that, he financed the rebuilding of their temple. He returned their sacred vessels. He restored their worship. For a moment in history, the most powerful empire on earth aligned itself with Israel's redemption. This was not coincidence. It was orchestration. Persia stood at the center of prophecy as a tool of restoration, not destruction. Jewish scribes preserved Cyrus's name with reverence. Persian kings protected Jewish communities. For generations, the relationship was not hostile. It was intimate, even cooperative. Because roles in sacred history are never neutral. To be used by God is to become contested ground. Empires may forget their conquests, but the unseen realm does not forget assignments. When Persia fulfilled a redemptive role in Israel's story, it crossed an invisible threshold. Something ancient took notice, something that had already laid claim to the region. The land that once sheltered Israel's hope would later resist Israel's existence. Not suddenly, not immediately, but inevitably. Because when a nation touches covenant history, it does not walk away unchanged. And as Persia's golden age fades into legend, another conflict begins to stir, one not written in stone or ink, but in the unseen struggle behind history itself. To understand why that shift occurred, we must step beyond kings and empires and listen to what Scripture reveals about the war no empire could see. Then Scripture pulls back the veil quietly, almost mercifully, so you can see what history alone cannot explain. In the book of Daniel, chapter 10, the prophet is not standing before kings. He is alone. He has been fasting for weeks, mourning, praying, seeking understanding. No spectacle, no applause. Just a man pressing his face toward heaven, asking why the future feels so heavy. And then a presence arrives. Not immediately, not triumphantly, delayed. That detail should stop you cold, because the messenger who finally appears says something no political analyst can translate and no empire can deny. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. 21 days. Not because Daniel lacked faith, not because God was absent, but because something resisted the message in transit. This prince is not Cyrus, not Darius, not any human ruler crowned with gold. A man cannot detain a heavenly messenger for 3 weeks. Only a power rooted to territory and authority seated over a realm could attempt such resistance. Persia was not merely an empire. Persia was a spiritual stronghold. And suddenly the ancient world looks different. The wars, the alliances, the betrayals, the shifting loyalties. Those were not only human choices, they were echoes, reflections, surface ripples of something deeper moving beneath. Then the messenger reveals the next escalation. Michael had to intervene. Michael, the guardian prince associated with Israel's destiny, enters the conflict to break the resistance. This is not poetic language. It is a glimpse into a hierarchy of spiritual powers contending over regions, peoples, and prophetic outcomes. And in that moment, Persia is no longer just a historical name. It becomes contested ground, a place where the unseen realm has invested interest. A territory where influence is not merely cultural or political, but spiritual, anchored, defended, and fought over. Quietly, another chilling implication rises. If Persia had a prince, then other kingdoms do as well. Daniel's vision is not isolated. It is a map, and maps tell you where the battles will happen before soldiers ever march. So when you ask why hostility can survive centuries, outliving dynasties, outliving languages, outliving borders, Daniel offers an answer that feels almost dangerous to say aloud. Some hatreds are not born in policy. They are sustained by powers that feed on division, resist covenant, and wage war against what God intends to restore. And if that is true, then the modern conflict is not the beginning. It is a flare-up of an ancient resistance, one that has been waiting, watching, adapting, and enduring. If you believe Scripture describes more than what the eye can see, share this not as content, but as testimony. Some truths only surface when they are carried together. And now the question becomes unavoidable. If Persia was once an instrument of Israel's restoration, how did a contested realm become a cradle of enduring hostility? Without losing its spiritual assignment, empires fall. Names change. The banners that once covered the horizon turn to dust, and the cities that once ruled the world become museums of stone. Persia becomes a memory spoken in foreign tongues, and the land begins to answer to a different name, Iran. Borders can be redrawn. Dynasties can collapse. Languages can vanish. Yet spiritual assignments do not retire. When Persia rose, it touched Israel's story in a way few nations ever have. It became an instrument in the hand of God, releasing exiles, restoring worship, rebuilding what Babylon tried to erase. That role should have marked Persia as a friend of the covenant, and for a time it did. But the deeper a nation is woven into sacred history, the more fiercely it can be contested by forces that oppose what God intends. This is the pattern hidden beneath the surface of Scripture. When God elevates a vessel, counterforces attempt to poison it. When God opens a door, something unseen tries to build a wall. When God restores something ancient, tries to reverse the restoration. And Persia was a door. Then time marched forward. Alexander shattered the Persian throne. Hellenistic culture flooded the region. New empires arrived, each claiming they had rewritten history: Seleucids, Parthians, Sasanians, each adding layers of identity, religion, and memory. Zoroastrian fire altars glowed against the night, speaking of cosmic conflict between light and darkness, truth and the lie. The land breathed an atmosphere of moral dualism, a worldview where the universe itself was a battlefield. And then centuries later, Islam arrived not as a blank slate, but as a new garment placed over an older spiritual geography. The hatred is not born of Islam. Islam inherits something older, because the hostility is not merely theological disagreement. It is not only geopolitical rivalry. It is a recurring resistance that keeps finding new language to speak through new flags, new slogans, new reasons. Modern Iran's obsession with Israel does not emerge from nowhere. It echoes a deeper tension, a land once aligned with Israel's restoration, now standing as if compelled to oppose Israel's existence. And that is what makes it feel irrational at times, almost mythic. Not because Iranians are irrational, but because the conflict often behaves like something more than human strategy, like a script repeating itself even when the actors change. A memory embedded in spiritual geography. Daniel already showed you that Persia was contested ground. Chapter 10 was not only a moment, it was a revelation. The region carries invisible pressure, and that pressure seeks outcomes. So the question shifts again. Not why does Iran hate Israel, but what happens to a nation when its destiny is fought over for centuries? Because in the next part, we confront the most dangerous layer of this story, the difference between human anger and spiritual resistance, and how one can masquerade as the other until nations believe it is their own voice. This is the uncomfortable conclusion, the one history resists and politics cannot contain. The conflict between Iran and Israel is not symmetrical. Israel represents a covenant line, a people formed not merely by ethnicity or empire, but by promise bound to a narrative that insists history is moving somewhere, not wandering endlessly. Iran, by contrast, sits on a territory once chosen, then contested. A land that stood close to Israel's restoration, then became a corridor of resistance. Not rejected by God, not cursed by Scripture, but fought over in ways few regions on earth have been. And when nations collide again and again, across centuries under different names, flags and creeds, Scripture urges us to look beyond human explanations. Because patterns reveal presence. Daniel already gave the language for it. There is a throne behind the throne. Power that does not campaign, does not vote, does not age. Power that influences direction rather than detail, hostility rather than policy. This does not remove human responsibility. Kings still choose. Leaders still act. People still suffer. Scripture never denies that. But it adds something modern analysis cannot afford to ignore. Some conflicts persist because they are fed by narratives older than the nations that carry them. Fed by resistance to covenant, to restoration, to the idea that history bends toward redemption rather than chaos. The hatred is not sustained by memory alone. It is sustained by opposition to what Israel represents. Not merely a state, not merely a people, but a testimony that God intervenes, restores, and keeps His word across time. And that testimony has always drawn resistance. Empires rose to crush it. They fell. Ideologies tried to erase it. They fractured. Territories were contested, reassigned, renamed. Yet, the covenant endured. Which forces the final unsettling question. If this conflict is older than modern borders, older than religions, older than empires, then it cannot be solved by force alone. Because you cannot bomb a throne you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot negotiate with a resistance that does not speak in treaties. And you cannot understand the present unless you are willing to confront the unseen past. This does not mean hatred is inevitable. Scripture never ends with despair. But it does mean clarity must come before peace. The Bible's vision is not that nations remain locked in endless war, but that thrones behind thrones are ultimately judged unseated and silenced. Until then, history will continue to echo what the unseen realm has not yet released. And perhaps the most dangerous mistake of all is believing this conflict began with human hands, when Scripture insists it began with a resistance far older, far quieter, and far more patient. What you choose to see now so determines how you interpret everything that follows, because some wars are not meant to be won by dominance, but by truth. This journey began with a simple question, and it led us far beyond headlines and borders into Scripture history and the unseen forces that shape them both. We traced a conflict not as a political accident, but as a pattern written deep into time, where covenant and resistance have collided for centuries. Now the story pauses, but it does not end. What you have heard is not meant to settle arguments, but to awaken discernment, to invite reflection long after the screen goes dark. History may explain what happened, but Scripture challenges us to ask why it keeps happening. If this exploration stirred something in you, support the journey by liking this video and sharing it with those who seek depth beyond the surface. Subscribe to continue walking through these hidden corridors of biblical and ancient history. Leave a comment with your thoughts, questions, or insights, and remain with us for the next chapter, because some mysteries do not close with answers, but open into deeper truths still waiting to be uncovered.